The glimmering skyline of Las Vegas is a beacon of possibility and excess. Its shimmering neon lights a siren's call for dreamers, gamblers, and lost souls. But beneath the glittering facade lies a darkness as deep as the desert night. This was the world of Jack "Lucky" Donovan, a man who epitomized the city's duality, charming yet dangerous, thrilling yet deadly. Jack wasn't your typical high roller. His tailored suits and polished shoes bespoke class. His slicked back hair and devilish grin exuded confidence. But it was his eyes that betrayed him. They were as cold and sharp as the edge of a dealer's knife, and behind them lurked a sinister obsession. Jack wasn't just addicted to the rush of the dice or the thrill of the spin. He had a more perverse craving. Jack's game wasn't only at the tables. He thrived in the spaces between the cards, in the dimly lit parking garages and empty back corridors of the casinos. His victims were those who had gambled everything and lost it all, the ones whose desperation made them invisible. To him, they were no longer people. They were part of the game, pieces to be moved, gambled, and discarded. Jack's killing spree began on a sweltering summer night, the strip pulsing with life and color. He had been watching her for hours. Her name was Maria, a waitress who worked double shifts at the Golden Mirage Casino. Her smile was weary, her posture slumped, her eyes hollow. She had just lost her paycheck at the slot machines, a desperate attempt to claw her way out of mounting debt. Jack approached her with his signature charm. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice smooth as velvet. Maria nodded, tears threatening to spill. I thought maybe tonight I'd get lucky." Jack chuckled, his grin spreading. "Luck's a fickle mistress, isn't she? Let me buy you a drink. I hate to see a beautiful woman so down." Maria hesitated but eventually agreed. That was Jack's specialty, knowing exactly how to worm his way into someone's trust. Hours later, Maria was lying in the desert, her throat slit, her body carefully posed as if she were holding a royal flush in her cold, dead hands. It was Jack's way of sending a message. To whom, he wasn't sure. Maybe the universe, maybe himself, but the sight of her lifeless body filled him with a sickening sense of satisfaction. The murders became a twisted ritual. Each victim was lured in by Jack's charm and the promise of luck in a city built on dreams. They were all people on the edge, down on their luck, desperate for a break. Jack would take them to his favorite casino haunts, buy them drinks, and charm them into a false sense of security. Then he would lead them to their doom. His methods varied: strangulation, stabbing, bludgeoning, but the aftermath was always the same. Each body was posed with a hand of cards, often symbolizing a losing hand, and placed in locations tied to the city's gambling culture. Deserted parking lots, abandoned motels, even the shadowy corners of the strip. The media dubbed him the Casino Reaper, and the city was gripped by fear. For months, Jack evaded capture, his killings becoming more brazen with each success. He relished the media frenzy, the way the headlines painted him as an enigmatic specter haunting the city's underbelly. Detective Elena Vargas had seen her fair share of gruesome crimes in her 15 years on the force. But the Casino Reaper case was unlike anything she'd encountered. A native Las Vegan, she had grown up in the shadows of the strip's neon glow, witnessing the highs and lows of its denizens. This case felt personal. Elena noticed the pattern early. Jack's victims weren't chosen at random. They were symbols of the city's broken promises, the casualties of its relentless pursuit of profit. But what haunted her most was the killer's precision, his ability to vanish into the chaos of the city without leaving a trace. Her break came when a surveillance camera captured a partial image of Jack leading his latest victim into a secluded alley. Though his face was obscured, the distinctive cufflinks he wore, a pair of gold dice, caught her attention. Jack's arrogance grew with each kill. He believed himself untouchable, a master of the ultimate game. But Elena's investigation was closing in. She began frequenting the casinos he was known to haunt, disguising herself as just another gambler. One night, their paths crossed. Jack, ever the predator, noticed her sitting alone at a blackjack table, nursing a drink. She was perfect, confident yet vulnerable, her eyes betraying a hint of sadness. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, flashing his trademark grin. Elena smiled coyly. "Be my guest. But fair warning, I'm not very lucky." Jack chuckled. "Maybe I can change that." For hours, they played their game of cat and mouse, each sizing the other up. Jack was drawn to Elena's sharp wit and fiery demeanor, unaware that she was laying a trap. Jack invited Elena to join him for a private game in one of the casino's high roller suites. She agreed, her heart pounding as she followed him up the elevator. Inside the lavish suite, Jack revealed his true colors, pulling a knife from his jacket. "I've enjoyed our little game," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "But all good things must come to an end." Elena smirked, pulling her gun from her purse and aiming it squarely at his chest. "You're right about that, Jack. Hands where I can see them." For the first time, Jack felt the icy grip of fear. He lunged at her, the knife glinting in the dim light, but Elena was faster. A single shot rang out, and Jack collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest as blood pooled beneath him. The Casino Reaper's reign of terror ended that night, but his legacy lingered. The city mourned its lost souls, their stories a stark reminder of the darkness that thrived in the shadow of the Strip's neon glow. Elena became a hero, but the case haunted her. She often wondered how many more victims Jack might have claimed if she hadn't caught him. And sometimes, late at night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Las Vegas itself had been complicit in his crimes. A city built on chance and risk, where the house always wins and everyone else pays the price. Richard Grom Jr. is an infamous American serial killer who gained notoriety for a chilling series of murders in Kansas during the late 1980s. Known for his charm and calculated demeanor, Grom's crimes were shocking, particularly because of the stark contrast between his outward appearance and his heinous actions. Richard Grom Jr. was born on November 10, 1960, in Concordia, Kansas. Not much is widely publicized about his upbringing, but accounts suggest he was a seemingly normal child with no glaring signs of the monstrous tendencies that would later emerge. However, like many serial killers, Grom developed a taste for crime early in life, leading to several encounters with law enforcement as a teenager. By the time he was in his 20s, Grom had developed a reputation for his charm and good looks. This veneer of normalcy and charisma would become one of his most dangerous tools. Grom's most infamous crimes occurred in 1989, targeting young women in Kansas. His victims were predominantly attractive, ambitious women in their 20s who crossed paths with him in social settings. Grom used his charm to gain their trust, but once they were under his control, he unleashed his violent tendencies. Joan Butler, 24 years old. A real estate agent from Overland Park, Kansas, Joan was last seen alive on June 18, 1989. Her apartment was found in disarray with bloodstains suggesting foul play. Joan's disappearance marked the beginning of Grom's known killing spree. Teresa Brown and Christine Rush, both 22 years old, friends who worked together and shared an apartment in Lenexa, Kansas. They vanished on June 25, 1989. Like Joan, evidence in their apartment pointed to violence, though their bodies were never recovered. Grom's method of disposing of his victims remains a mystery, as their bodies were never found. Despite the lack of physical remains, authorities were able to link Grom to the murders through forensic evidence, including blood traces and items left at the crime scenes. The investigation into Grom's crimes was complex and intense. Detectives meticulously pieced together clues from the victims' apartments, connecting the cases through similarities in the crime scenes and circumstantial evidence. They identified Grom as a suspect through a combination of witness statements, credit card records, and forensic analysis. Grom's use of his victims' credit cards after their murders became a critical piece of evidence against him. His attempts to withdraw cash and make purchases left a trail that police followed. Additionally, Grom's criminal history provided investigators with a clearer picture of his escalating violence. Grom fled to Texas after his final murders, evading capture for several weeks. Authorities tracked him to Dallas, where he was arrested on July 7, 1989, after a tense standoff. At the time of his arrest, Grom was living under an alias and had dyed his hair in an attempt to disguise himself. In 1990, Richard Grom Jr. was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The circumstantial nature of the evidence against him, combined with the absence of the victims' bodies, made the case particularly challenging. But prosecutors succeeded in securing convictions due to the strength of the forensic and circumstantial evidence. Richard Grom Jr. is currently serving his life sentence at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. He has maintained his innocence, refusing to disclose the locations of his victims' bodies, leaving their families without closure. Grom's case remains one of the most chilling in Kansas history, a haunting reminder of how appearances can be deceiving. His ability to charm his victims and avoid detection for so long speaks to the danger posed by such predators. Despite his incarceration, the pain he inflicted on the families of his victims lingers, amplified by the unanswered questions about the fates of those he killed. For many, the story of Richard Grom Jr. is a testament to the resilience of investigators and the devastating toll of violent crime. But it is also a sobering look at how evil can lurk behind the most unassuming facades. The story of Lizzy Halliday is one of deception, madness, and gruesome murder. Dubbed by some as America's first female serial killer, Halliday's life and crimes shocked late 19th century America, leaving a trail of bloodshed and mystery that would earn her a grim place in history. Her life was a blend of manipulation, cruelty, and chaos, culminating in a murder spree that shocked a nation still grappling with the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Elizabeth McNally, later known as Lizzy Halliday, was born in County Antrim, Ireland, around 1859. Her family emigrated to the United States in the 1860s, settling in New York during a time when the nation was recovering from the Civil War. Lizzy's early years remain largely undocumented, but she was described as a troubled and erratic child. By her teenage years, Lizzy's behavior became increasingly unstable. She exhibited signs of mental illness, though mental health was poorly understood and stigmatized in her era. Lizzy also showed an early penchant for deception, often fabricating stories about herself and those around her. These traits would later play a significant role in her life and crimes. Lizzy's early adult life was marked by a string of marriages, suspicious deaths, and mysterious disappearances. Over the years, she married several men, many of whom died under suspicious circumstances. Though few deaths were initially linked to her, hindsight reveals a pattern of treachery. Lizzy married several men in quick succession, often under different aliases. These marriages frequently ended in tragedy, with her husbands dying from unexplained illnesses or accidents. In many cases, Lizzy quickly disappeared afterward, leaving no trace. Lizzy's most infamous relationship was with Paul Halliday, a Civil War veteran and farmer from Sullivan County, New York. By the time Lizzy married Paul in 1888, she had already developed a reputation as a difficult and unstable woman. Paul was significantly older and widowed, with children from his previous marriage. Their relationship was tumultuous. Lizzy clashed with Paul's family, often accusing them of theft or harboring ill will toward her. She was known to disappear for days or weeks at a time, only to return without explanation. In 1891, Paul's home mysteriously burned to the ground, killing one of his sons, John Halliday, who was bedridden at the time. Authorities suspected arson, and Lizzy was questioned, but no charges were filed. The true scope of Lizzy's madness became clear in the summer of 1893. After Paul Halliday went missing, neighbors grew suspicious of Lizzy. They noticed her erratic behavior and strange comments, prompting them to alert local authorities. When police arrived at the Halliday farm to investigate, they made a series of horrifying discoveries. Paul's mutilated body was found buried on the property. He had been killed with a hatchet, his body showing signs of a brutal attack. Further investigation revealed the bodies of Margaret and Sarah McQuillan, two women Lizzy had hired as housekeepers. Both women had been shot and buried in shallow graves on the farm. They were sisters from Ireland, lured by Lizzy's promises of work and security. Authorities suspected Lizzy in several other deaths and disappearances, including previous husbands and local residents who had crossed her path. Lizzy Halliday's trial was a media sensation, drawing nationwide attention. Her case was one of the first involving a female serial killer in the United States, challenging contemporary perceptions of women and violence. Throughout the trial, Lizzy's behavior was erratic. She frequently disrupted proceedings with outbursts, claimed innocence despite overwhelming evidence, and accused others of conspiring against her. Her defense team argued that she was insane, pointing to her long history of instability. Ultimately, Lizzy was convicted of the murders, but narrowly avoided the death penalty. Instead, she was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Matewan State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Fishkill, New York. Lizzy's time in Matewan was marked by further violence and chaos. She attacked staff members, tried to escape multiple times, and even killed a nurse, Nellie Wicks, by stabbing her with scissors in 1906. Despite these incidents, Lizzy remained at Matewan until her death. Lizzy Halliday died in 1918 at Matewan State Hospital. She left behind a legacy of infamy as one of America's earliest and most notorious female serial killers. Her case has since been studied by criminologists, historians, and psychologists, seeking to understand the mind of a killer in a time when such crimes were often attributed solely to men. Herbert William Mullen was a name that sent shivers through Santa Cruz County, California in the early 1970s. While the period saw other infamous killers like Edmund Kemper stalking the same area, Mullen's spree stood out for its sheer randomness and a chilling motive born from delusions. Between October 1972 and February 1973, Mullen killed 13 people in a twisted attempt to prevent a catastrophic earthquake. His crimes, fueled by schizophrenia and paranoia, remain a grim reminder of the devastating intersection of untreated mental illness and violence. Herbert Mullen was born on April 18, 1947 in Salinas, California, to a seemingly stable middle-class family. His father, a World War II veteran, was strict yet supportive, and Mullen showed promise as a child. He was described as intelligent, athletic, and well-liked during his school years. In high school, Mullen had a close-knit group of friends and even dated, showing no outward signs of the darkness to come. However, tragedy struck when his best friend, Dean Richardson, died in a car accident shortly after their graduation in 1965. Mullen was devastated. He built a shrine in his bedroom to Dean, a gesture that friends initially saw as grieving, but later viewed as a harbinger of his deteriorating mental health. In the years following Richardson's death, Mullen's behavior became increasingly erratic. After attending Cabrillo College and later San Jose State University, he dropped out and began experimenting with LSD and marijuana. While drug use may have exacerbated his condition, psychiatrists later diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, a disorder that had already begun to manifest in bizarre ways. By the late 1960s, Mullen believed he was receiving telepathic messages and began hearing voices. He blamed these auditory hallucinations on his family and became fixated on apocalyptic visions. Mullen's delusions grew more elaborate. He came to believe that human sacrifices were necessary to prevent a catastrophic earthquake that would devastate California. Despite his family's attempts to get him help, Mullen refused treatment. In an era when mental health services were underfunded and involuntary commitment laws were restrictive, Mullen slipped through the cracks. Mullen's killing spree began on October 13, 1972, his 25th year. Over the next 4 months, he would murder 13 people, chosen seemingly at random, as sacrifices to prevent an earthquake. Mullen's first victim was a homeless man named Lawrence White, whom he bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat. Mullen later claimed that White was a willing sacrifice, telepathically agreeing to die to save others. On October 24, 1972, Mullen picked up 24-year-old Mary Guilfoyle, a Cabrillo College student, hitchhiking. He stabbed her to death and mutilated her body, leaving her remains in a wooded area. This escalation in violence demonstrated Mullen's growing detachment from reality and increasing cruelty. On November 2, 1972, Mullen entered St. Mary's Catholic Church in Los Gatos, where he encountered Father Henri Tomé. After confessing to the priest, Mullen stabbed him to death. He later claimed that Father Tomé had offered himself as a sacrifice, though witnesses reported the priest had fought for his life. By January 1973, Mullen's killings became more frequent and brazen. On January 25th, he murdered 4 teenage boys, David Oliker, Robert Spector, Brian Card, and Mark Drybelbis, who were camping in Henry Cowell Redwoods State Park. Posing as a park ranger, Mullen shot them in cold blood. Just days later, Mullen entered the home of Jim Gianera, a former friend from high school, and shot both him and his wife, Joan. He then murdered Kathy Francis, a woman who had unwittingly provided Mullen with Gianera's address, along with her 2 young sons, David and Damon. Mullen's final victim, Fred Perez, was gunned down on February 13, 1973, while gardening in front of his home in Santa Cruz. Witnesses saw Mullen fleeing the scene in his car and reported his license plate number to the police. He was arrested shortly thereafter without incident. During questioning, Mullen confessed to all 13 murders, detailing his delusions and explaining that his actions were necessary to save California from an earthquake. Chillingly, he claimed that his sacrifices had worked, citing the absence of a major earthquake during his spree as proof. At his trial, Mullen's defense team argued that he was insane, presenting his history of schizophrenia and delusions as evidence. However, the prosecution countered that Mullen had shown premeditation and awareness of his actions, such as cleaning up evidence and evading capture. In 1973, Mullen was convicted of 10 murders, 3 were dismissed due to lack of evidence, and sentenced to life in prison. Herbert Mullen remains incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in California. Though he has applied for parole multiple times, his petitions have been denied, as he continues to show little remorse for his actions. Mullen's time in prison has been marked by conflicts with other inmates, including a violent altercation with fellow serial killer Edmund Kemper, who reportedly viewed Mullen as disruptive and annoying. Herbert Mullen's crimes shocked Santa Cruz and remain some of the most horrifying in California's history. His spree is a stark example of how untreated mental illness, societal failures, and access to weapons can converge to disastrous effect. Israel Keyes is one of the most enigmatic and terrifying serial killers in modern history. Known for his meticulous planning, chilling detachment, and a complete lack of remorse, Keyes' crimes spanned the United States and defied conventional profiling. Unlike most serial killers who focus on a particular type of victim or area, Keyes deliberately avoided patterns, traveling vast distances, using kill kits he had buried years in advance, and targeting victims of opportunity. His story is a chilling reminder of the capabilities of a calculating, organized, and utterly ruthless mind. Israel Keyes was born on January 7, 1978, in Richmond, Utah, the second of 10 children in a devoutly religious and insular family. His parents, Heidi and John Keyes, were strict fundamentalist Christians who raised their children in extreme isolation. The family eventually moved to Colville, Washington, where they lived in a remote cabin without electricity or running water. The Keyes family was deeply entwined with fringe religious groups, including the Christian Identity Movement, which espouses racist and anti-Semitic beliefs. This environment of isolation and extremism likely shaped Keyes' worldview and fueled his disdain for societal norms. As a child, Keyes exhibited early signs of psychopathy. He tortured animals, a common precursor to violent behavior, and was fascinated with weapons. Despite these red flags, he managed to blend in well enough, masking his darker impulses behind a facade of normalcy. In 1998, at the age of 20, Keyes enlisted in the U.S. Army. He served as a specialist, stationed in Fort Lewis, Fort Hood, and even abroad in Egypt. His colleagues described him as quiet but reliable, with no outward signs of the depravity lurking within. During his service, Keyes honed his skills with firearms and discipline, both of which would play critical roles in his later crimes. After his honorable discharge in 2001, Keyes began to escalate his criminal behavior. Though his military training provided structure, it also fed his ability to operate methodically and without detection. Unlike many serial killers who fall into predictable patterns, Israel Keyes prided himself on being untraceable. He traveled extensively, targeting victims in random locations across the United States. He buried kill kits containing weapons, restraints, and tools years before committing his murders, ensuring that his crimes were premeditated yet devoid of local connections. Keyes chose victims of opportunity rather than specific types, further complicating law enforcement efforts to track him. His victims included young and old, male and female, and individuals from different racial and socioeconomic backgrounds. Keyes abducted 18-year-old Samantha Koenig from a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska. He forced her to reveal her bank card PIN, killed her, and left her body in a shed while he went on a cruise with his family. Upon returning, he staged a photo of her corpse to make it appear as though she was alive, sending a ransom demand to her family. After withdrawing money using her bank card, he dismembered her body and disposed of it in a frozen lake. In Essex, Vermont, Keyes broke into the home of Bill and Lorraine Currier, abducted them, and killed them in an abandoned house. Their bodies were never found, but Keyes confessed to the crime, providing details only the killer could know. Keyes claimed to have killed at least 11 people, though authorities suspect the number could be higher. He hinted at crimes dating back to the late 1990s, with potential victims scattered across the country. His methodical approach and lack of pattern make it impossible to determine the true scope of his crimes. Keyes' downfall began in 2012 after he used Samantha Koenig's debit card in multiple states, leaving a trail of ATM withdrawals. On March 13, 2012, he was arrested in Texas. Authorities initially believed they had apprehended a lone bank robber, but as they interrogated him, the horrifying truth emerged. Keyes admitted to Koenig's murder and revealed details of other crimes. However, he refused to provide specifics unless authorities agreed to his terms, including a quick execution. His confessions were chillingly matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion or remorse. Israel Keyes was a textbook example of a psychopath. He was intelligent, manipulative, and completely devoid of empathy. Unlike impulsive killers driven by rage or compulsion, Keyes was a planner. He derived pleasure not from the act of killing itself, but from the control and meticulous preparation involved. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes allowed him to lead a seemingly normal life as a father and business owner in Anchorage. Keyes' crimes also reflected a nihilistic worldview. He expressed disdain for humanity and societal norms, viewing himself as superior to those he victimized. In his own words, he saw murder as a hobby, a personal game he could play without consequence. On December 2, 2012, Israel Keyes committed suicide in his jail cell in Anchorage, Alaska, cutting his wrists and strangling himself with a bedsheet. He left behind a blood-stained suicide note, a cryptic, rambling diatribe filled with poetic musings but offering no closure for his victims' families. Keyes' death robbed authorities of the chance to fully understand the scope of his crimes. Investigators believe he was responsible for far more murders than he confessed to, but without his cooperation, many of these cases remain unsolved.